So thank you very much, Joe, for inviting me here. A number of other years you invited me. I was involved in our Columban summer school. Last year we were in Clare Island. This year we were down in Offaly. I'm a Columban missionary. I spent a lot of my time in the Philippines. I suppose I got involved in issues of the environment when I was working with a tribal people up in the hills of South Cotabato, the Tiboli people. And I saw there the extraordinary destruction of the tropical rainforest. This was way back in 1978. And at that time I saw there was very little being said in the Christian churches, particularly in the Catholic Church, about any moral critique of what was happening. So then extraordinarily, last year, Pope Francis published this Laudato Si Mi Signores. It's the beginning of the prayer of St. Francis, praise to you, my Lord. And it is, in my estimation, the finest document that has come out of Rome, at least for 500 years. In the modern period, we've had Catholic social teaching from 1891, that on the beginning of our critique, 50 years after Marx, of industrialization. It was called Rerum Novarum, new things. But it was directed to bishops and cardinals and patriarchs. This is directed to everyone. We all share this environment. And whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jew, we all have to live with this environment and actually use the insights of our tradition to get the kind of sustainability that the previous two speakers have talked about. So he talks about climate change. Now, this was quite a contentious issue in the Catholic Church. In 2007, there was a meeting in Rome, and the cardinal involved, he brought 4 or 5 skeptics from the United States. So there was a real fear that pressure would have been put on Francis to have a maybe. And of course, he did not do that. He said very clearly in number 23 of Laudato Si, a very solid scientific consensus indicates we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climate system. So that was terribly important. That clear message got out. And I'm sure as you listened to John tonight, he underlined it in so many, many different ways. And then he goes on to talk about, yes, it is because mainly of human activity. It's because of greenhouse gas emissions, the one we talked mostly about tonight, or carbon dioxide. We also talked about methane, nitrous oxide, and others. So, yeah, human responsibilities has to be taken for this reality that's taking place. And then he goes on to talk about, if present trends continue, the century will witness extraordinary climate changes and unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for us all. So that's the kind of world we're living in. What I'm going to do here in this presentation is look at just 2 things that has happened since then. One in the environmental area and the other in poverty area, that these catastrophes are actually beginning at the moment. We're not actually going to be waiting, because if we wait to what John is talking about, we will have brought about a geological order of magnitude changes. And in the traditional world of geology, geological changes were 20 million years. The upper Carboniferous, the lower Carboniferous, the Cretaceous was 45, 50 million years. But what we'll be talking about is a change that took place in 200 years since the beginning of industrialization. So we're looking at here something that's happened in the last year to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. There you can see it. It's the biggest and longest living structure on the planet. It's 1,400 miles long. Many of you may have visited it. It stretches from north of Brisbane right up to Papua New Guinea. And it can be seen from space. It's the same size as Germany. So it's an extraordinary living organism on the planet. And in the last year, you've had... it provides, for example, unique living spaces for many animals and for fish. They give 1,600 different species of fish, 133 species of shark, ray, species of whales and dolphins. So it's an extraordinarily important place for biodiversity across the world. And that's one of the serious issues of climate change. It's bringing about a destruction, an extinction of biodiversity on an extraordinary level. It's also a huge economic value to Australia. The Guardian there a few weeks ago said it contributes £3 billion to the Australian economy. So we're looking at a phenomenon that happens every maybe 6 to 10 years. El Nino. It starts in the eastern Pacific off the coast of Peru. It was called El Nino because it happened very often around Christmas time. So it was called after the Christ child. So this particular process with climate change has had a huge impact on the Great Barrier Reef. And of course, with these kind of reefs, as we'll see, all you need is a very small change that will bring about major changes. From the mid-1980s on, carbon dioxide has been pumped by humans into the atmosphere, and now we're close to 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level, as the ocean has warmed. And now it's close to what corals can bear. And we'll see this for a few moments. Today, the Great Barrier Reef, 93% of 3,000 species have been adversely affected. And this was about 5 weeks ago, it's 30% of corals has been killed. This is an extraordinary catastrophe and tragedy. And it hasn't got it's a major ecological catastrophe, yet it has received little enough attention in the press, and certainly in this country. So, this man was astonished at his experience of diving. He runs a diving process around Lizard Island. I can't tell you how bad I smelt after the dive, smelling of millions of rotting animals. This was on The Guardian just a few weeks ago. This is the coral bleaching. It's the greatest and worst bleaching in recent history. The Great Barrier Reef is only 10,000 years old, but this is estimated the worst bleaching of all times. Now, it happens for 2 reasons. First of all, slight changes in the temperature of water. Just a single degree Celsius change is enough to bring it about, or excessive nutrients coming into the water from agricultural runoffs from Australia. And this is what has happened. The stress caused the current polyps to expel the algae which live in their tissue and provide them with their energy. When that happens, the corals begin to starve. If the conditions continue for a long period of time, or not so long, a year or 2, they die off. Now, I saw it happening in the Philippines, and in my years there, it was there actually because of deforestation. The earth and soil coming down into the tropical sea and interfering with photosynthesis. And I remember many places where I swam, say in 1969 and 70, going back there 20 years later, the corals all gone, and it was like swimming through a cemetery. So that's the kind of world that we're talking about. The projections are, if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, all the corals will be gone globally by the year 2050. So what's the knock-on effect in terms of biodiversity when something like this happens? Fish that feed on the corals, they have to go, or they move on elsewhere. You have seabirds that depend on the ocean for their food. They're next to go. Then you have even plants which rely on bird droppings. They are effectively negated. So there's a whole knock-on impact on the wonder and reality of biodiversity. And of course, as a human community, we have no idea of actually the wonder of biodiversity on our planet. If you go to Kew Gardens, you'll see some descriptions there of about 2 million species. But we have no idea how many million species are there on the planet. Is it 5? Probably more. Is it 10? Well, we don't know. Is it 13? It could be. I mean, in the tropical rainforest where I worked, like we here in Ireland, we have about 20 species of indigenous trees. Where I worked in Lake Cebu, I got a lot of help. At that stage, you wouldn't get help from Catholic groups. If you sent into Trocra for money to help with reforestation, they'd look at you and say, what are you at? Then they, build a school or build a hospital, but not something in terms of the environment. But I got a lot of help from the Australian government. And before I left there in about 1997, a team came down, and in areas of the Dipterocarp forest, we found 120 species of trees in a single hectare of land. So the reality, that's the emergence of life on Earth over 3 billion years. And now we're closing that down, and closing it down permanently. That's the reality of biodiversity. And as John said, you know, the wonder sound of the curlew in Irish culture and mythology, it's gone. The 97% fall in curlew in the last 40 years. So the Australian government are in denial about what's happening. For example, they took every single mention of what's happening in the reefs out of the UNESCO documents, because they realise if the tourists begin to realise that this is what's happening to the reefs, they won't come there. But you would think the biology of the place would take much more precedence over that. So, about 10 years before that, the Catholic bishops of Queensland published an excellent pastoral letter on what's happening. So that's one issue of a catastrophe. The Laudato Si also talked about the impact of climate change on the poor. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in the coming decades. This is only last week. Many people live in areas particularly affected by the phenomenon related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing and forestry. And they have no other financial activities or no other resources to enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters. And their access to social services are very often, this would happen in my world in the Taboli, are limited or very little. For example, changes in climate to which animals and plants cannot adapt lead them to migrate. So, this in turn affects the livelihood of the poor, who are then forced to leave their homes with great uncertainty for their future and that of their children. This is all part of the development that Pope Francis does on the impact of climate change. Well, again, this year, both the El Nino effect, I lived in the Philippines, the previous worst El Nino event was in 1982, when I lived through about 6 months of drought. It has exacerbated climate change and drought in Latin America, South Asia, and particularly in Africa. So, major aid organisations have warned that by Christmas this year, 50 million people in Eastern Africa and South Africa will need food aid. And here are some of them. The second year of drought, for example, took place in Eastern Africa this year. Staple crops withered, water supplies diminished, food prices skyrocketed. These are some of the scenes. 31 million people are now in need of food aid, but this will rise dramatically towards the end of the year. As the climate change and El Nino drought continues, 10 million people in Ethiopia. Former President Mary Robinson came back from there the other day and talked about her experience there. 6 million people in Sudan, 5 million people in Yemen will be in need of humanitarian aid. So this is a catastrophe in part due to climate change right at this moment. Food security around Africa will deteriorate dramatically, reaching its peak between December and March of next year. Now, at the same time, you have donor fatigue in response to that. We've been giving. Are we going to continue to give? And as we will see, what's happening there is we are partly responsible by what we're doing with climate change here. Bringing food aid to starving people in Malawi might be a nightmare because of donor fatigue. There's no money to buy food and to open up the markets for food for people, so you're facing famine. In 2015, in many of the countries which surrounded Malawi, there was a double disaster. Prolonged drought followed by severe flood, and now another drought again. And this year's drought, last year 2.8 million people were affected, a deficit of 220,000 tons of food. In 2016, the situation is 4 times worse than it was actually in 2015. So, one of the complicating factors is, of course, in South and East Africa, is that South Africa, which normally was a place where they could get food, they too are suffering from the present climate change. This year, South Africa's agriculture has been adversely affected by the drought. And so instead of exporting food, they are actually importing food to feed their own people. So people will be looking for other means to get food into Africa. So there's fears about November or December this year, there will be real issues about starvation again. Will it be possible? The roads might be impassable, making the distribution of food to people who need it extraordinarily difficult. So here's a look at our own. I'm not going to spend much time on this. John talked about it. Grace talked about it. The plans we have for expanding agriculture here. And here's one of from the Irish Times correspondent there, how much powdered milk we're sending to China. And as John said, we're sending that powdered milk out, hoping the Chinese mothers won't breastfeed their children. And here at home, we're asking them to breastfeed their children. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. He also dealt with some of those issues, the carbon footprint, he talked about that. But here's the reality as of last year. Lord Stern, an economist who did an extraordinary amount of work on climate change, the EU needed to go beyond the existing national pledges of cutting greenhouse gases emissions by 40% by 2013. 140 countries have already submitted their plan for greenhouse gas emissions, though not enough to meet the targets of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So, Grace talked about the two messages from Taoiseach. I won't go through them in detail. Yes, he says, at COP21 in Paris, he said every country has to play its part, big or small. Ireland is dependent to play its part. We have committed ourselves with the EU emissions of at least 40% by 2030. And then the very next day, he talked to journalists and basically, well, in a sense, mispresented. He said that the amount of money in the food aid budget or the aid budget that actually goes into climate change issues. But in actual fact, it doesn't go into, as we will see in a moment. He also told reporters it's not realistic for Ireland's agricultural sector to meet the EU targets for cutting carbon emissions. And this is the fund, the Green Fund, which is set up, the Green Climate Fund, by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You can see we're there right at the very bottom. Ireland, like Belgium, they have 54,000 and per capita 6.2. We're right down here at 57 pence. So, Mrs. Robinson came back from Ethiopia there the other day. After her recent, she talked to the Irish Examiner that emissions problems of the rich world are punishing the poor. She continued, it's hard to argue with that assessment, considering that we in Ireland produce almost 100 times more emissions per head of population than the entire people of Ethiopia. So that's the reality that we face. Now, again, in his document on Laudato Si, one of the issues that the Pope took up seriously was ethical issues in response to our new knowledge of what's happening to the environment. And in number 8, again, one of the extraordinary things of this encyclical, normally popes in encyclicals, they'll quote the scriptures, they might quote some of the fathers, they don't quote the mothers of the church. Hopefully, in a few years' time, we'll be quoting the mothers of the church. They quote people in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, and then they quote themselves. This man quotes everyone. And the person he quotes most at that is the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, yeah. And he has a great tradition of actually environmental care since he became patriarch in 1991. So he says, for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the waters, its land, its air, and its life. And then he says something that is extraordinarily important, but we don't believe it. These are sins. So that's the new world that's facing all of the Christian churches, that we're now beginning to realize that what we have been doing, actually in that relationship, not just with God, also with other human beings, but our relationship now with the natural world is a moral reality. And we're going to have to develop that moral imagination so that that actually phrase reverberates in our mind. This is the world we're involved in. For to commit a sin against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. I'm sure many of us here who are Christian and were brought up in our Christian education wouldn't actually take that on board at the moment. But that's the place all of us who are in the Christian tradition, not just in the Christian tradition, the tradition of all the great religions, will have to be taking. And I finish with the most chilling paragraph I've ever read in a papal encyclical. And I'll finish with it now. Doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony and disdain. It's number 161. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation and filth. The pace of consumption, waste and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes. Thank you.